And we'll move on next to Arlan, who will bring us up to date with Katrina and a life after smallpox. And it's the biggest file I've ever dealt with.
Well, it really is a great pleasure to be here. And unlike the people that you've heard from largely, with the exception of Jeannie, I'm not a public health professional. So I come to this forum in gratitude. Let's see, where's my button? In response to Stan's designing this program, partly to share some of the legacies of the smallpox measles program and their impact on individuals, families, and communities. So I'm going to be talking more from the personal impact standpoint on my own career. And also in response to Dave Sensor's request that for the exhibit, we write down 3 important things that the African experience meant to us, either personally or from a public health standpoint. And my response to that was that it provided an exceptional, for a pediatric endocrinologist, career-long epidemiology public health perspective pervading teaching, clinical research, and clinical service program development. Continued international interests that have led to research, education, and program development for students in international settings, and has been a source of enormous pride in being part of the U.S. Public Health Service, especially through participating in a historic achievement continued in the rejuvenated inactive Reserve Corps officer training and deployment for disaster response. So that's what I'm going to be addressing partly. Just to give you a little bit of background, I was drafted during the Vietnam era with 4 kids ranging in age from, well, when I was drafted, from not being born yet to 6 years of age. And so I came, and because I spoke French and had been in Southeast Asia as a GP before I specialized and subspecialized, I was able to get into the smallpox eradication program, and I'm enormously grateful to D.A. Henderson, who actually came up to Madison, I think mostly to interview Edith to find out if she was going to be able to support this crazy pediatric endocrinologist for a couple of years in Africa, and graciously took us on. The rest is history, of course. Now, I've maintained my smallpox chops, if you will, by giving an annual lecture in the College of Health and Human Performance on campus to an international health forum. And I used to give this talk, I've been giving it for 20-plus years, I used to give it as a history lesson, and in the last few years I've changed the title to, as you can see, to Pox, Politics and Paranoia, in response to the 2003 abortive campaign, and some would say ill-conceived. I've depended a great deal on Tom Mack's excellent paper in the New England Journal of Medicine, for which I quote extensively in the talk now, as an object lesson in public health. In 1983, I signed on to be assistant medical director to David French for 3 months. They needed a temporary assistant medical director. Many of you know David. With the Boston University Health Policy Institute, the Project for Strengthening Health Delivery Systems in Central and West Africa, which was an outgrowth of the smallpox program and reflected the desire of the 20 countries to continue to work together in what some would consider the only real Pan-African project that ever worked. Went back to Abidjan, where I had been only once before for a smallpox meeting in 1967, and found that there were great changes, monuments to neocolonialism of an economic rather than administrative kind, reflected in huge bank buildings, huge hotels, huge office buildings, which weren't helping people very much. But that's another story. We had part of my responsibilities. I went around. I spent my time going from country to country, helping develop operational research projects, which the Boston project supported with small grants. But I also had the privilege of organizing the disease surveillance conference that was held in Freetown in Sierra Leone, and was able to go back there in 1984 to participate in that conference, which CDC participated in. Introduced the theme of the conference was the use of computers in disease surveillance. Now, this is 1984. You don't find many K-Pro 2s around anymore. And he was referring to my file earlier. My file is about 4 times the memory that was in one of those computers, the hard disk memory. One of the persistent and impressive experiences that relates to much of what has been said this morning, particularly by Dave just before me, was a visit we arranged to a model village in northern Sierra Leone, where the NGOs in this area, in this district, had all come under the head of one NGO, one director who happened to be a priest, but all of the NGOs reported to him on their health projects, and he was the director of them, along with the medical director of the region. Working together, developed systems for improving health in villages. And this was a phenomenal experience. It involved health education. It involved such low-cost, highly effective things as penning in the animals, handling of waste, protecting the wells, but above all, co-opting the leadership in the community, the educational leadership, the tribal leadership, to set the goals, to commit the resources in sweat equity and dollars to carry out these functions and make them sustainable. Well, my next adventure that relates to this, I'll get to Katrina eventually. The title is not fallacious. Goes from the mountains of Cameroon to the Ecuadorian Andes. And these were very similar experiences, except that one was public health and the other was epidemiologic research, because in order to get to many of the places in the Andes, it required going over very difficult terrain or getting there on foot for many hours of walking, after many hours of walking. But this was a highly productive endeavor where I think my epidemiologic, shoe leather epidemiology experience was extremely important, and many of my colleagues in pediatric endocrinology have told me so, because they could never imagine doing something like this. In order to do this, though, we depended on communication with the local culture, as you saw in the previous slide with Jaime Guevara, who happened to be from that area, whose family was in the road building business, so we had the equipment in order to get to these places, and the drivers who knew where these towns were, who knew where these people were in the valleys of the southern Ecuadorian Andes. And we were able to be productive academically with this project, The Little Women of Loja. Now, a couple of years ago, the Office for Research Affairs, the Office for Reserve Affairs of the U.S. Public Health Service became active and offered a basic officer training course. I called up and said, you know, I'm 70 years old. This is a couple of years ago. I'm 70 years old. Said, oh, you won't be the oldest one there. That's okay. I wasn't the oldest one there. There's an NIH, very active, still researcher at NIH, research psychologist, who's 6 years older than I am. The basic officer training course gave me the opportunity to own my first public health service uniform, which made Edith very happy. You know, she's a sucker for a guy in a uniform. And fortunately, I was the guy. And it was a very interesting experience. I learned about officership, about leadership, and brought back memories of much of what we had to do as leaders in the public health service. As a result of this, I responded to a plea for post-Katrina work and went to St. Bernard Parish after talking with the leader there, and who assured me that the fact that I hadn't practiced general medicine for 40 years would not be a hindrance, that he hadn't practiced general medicine for 15 years or 20 years. He was professor of oncology at Emory. And I wound up in St. Bernard Parish, which is just east of the 9th Ward that you all know about. Chalmette Battlefield is down here, and that's really where the Battle of New Orleans was fought. The people in St. Bernard Parish go way back, and they actually have Spanish names. They were original settlers in several hundred years ago, and they actually defended Chalmette before Andrew Jackson got there, held off the British, and they're very proud of that. And it ain't the Battle of New Orleans, I now know, it's the Battle of Chalmette. So St. Bernard Parish had 27,000 homes made inhabitable. They were flooded through the channel to the Gulf here from behind. No livable residences were left. All the businesses were wiped out. 100+ people killed by the floods. The setting was surrealistic. Destruction after destruction. And, you know, you see it on television and it has an impact, but when you're actually in it, there's a poignancy and a depression that persists. Day after day, week after week, absolute devastation. And for these people who were fishermen and worked in the refinery, there was no work left. The hospital was destroyed. 140 physicians, 3 came back, and we worked with those 3. The last one to leave left from the top of this hospital after evacuating a nursing home and all of his patients. He was the last one to leave. Our clinic was a triple wide, set up on the FEMA compound. Of course, FEMA was very much loved there, as you can imagine. They were still trying to hand out trailers that were piled up on lots. And we worked with a mix of volunteers, reserve officers, myself, and a nurse captain. The commander was Otis Browley at the time I was there, who was a reservist and the professor of oncology at Emory. And there's one other reserve, a pharmacist, Steve. And local people, local nurses, and physicians. We saw 140 to 200 patients a day, 7 days a week. I couldn't believe that at my age I could get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, report to work, leave at 7:30 at night, and do the same thing day after day after day for 3 weeks. But I did it. And it was one of the most rewarding experiences I've ever had, comparable to being in the public health, being with the smallpox eradication program. It was a very poignant experience. Everybody had a story to tell. These people were enormously resilient, having lost everything. They came back, they were trying to rebuild their lives. The few who had trailers, some were living in trailers, some were living in tents, some were living with friends in areas of the city that were not damaged. It was really a remarkable experience to meet these people and to be inspired. One of the most inspiring things was the annual St. Bernard Parish German-Irish Parade, which they insisted on having, and you would not have believed that these people were under the kind of pressures they were under. But they created a problem for us because we had to treat vegetable injuries. They throw vegetables, and vegetables can be dangerous when you're hit by. We repaired people who were hit by flying carrots, flying cabbages, and so on. But we also gathered a lot of material for an excellent vegetable stew that one of the locals made for us. I took the advantage after this to go to advanced officer training a couple of months ago, and as you see, we had a very large class at the advanced officer training, and Admiral Moritsugu again was there giving out the diplomas, and that too was a very rewarding experience. We learned more about disaster control and disaster response, and particularly more about officership, and particularly about how the Corps was being reorganized in order to respond more effectively to disasters. And I would refer you to the federal response to Hurricane Katrina, the lessons learned, from which this quote comes, that HHS should organize, train, equip, and roster medical and public health professionals in pre-configured and deployable teams. The Commission Corps response teams, a thumbnail sketch can be downloaded from the PHS website or from this link. Now, you may have noticed on my blouse at the first graduation that I was wearing this medal, which was given out by Admiral Moritsugu to all the graduates of the Basic Officer Training Corps as associate recruiters. And I'm here to tell those of you who have been in the public health service and those of you who are young in the public health service that staying in the Corps is a good idea, or signing up for the Corps if you are a veteran of the PHS is one way that you can become involved in necessary deployments that will be better organized, that will be as rewarding an experience as you can possibly imagine. And get in touch with Josh Harden or get in touch with me if you need his address. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart.